A gangster's ledger hides deadly secrets. Welcome to Shadow Code, I'm Thornwick. Tell me where you're listening from. Your comments bring these mysteries to life. If a bookkeeper ever sweats on your doorstep, you can bet his ledgers carry more blood than ink. I learned that lesson on a Tuesday morning in October, when the autumn rain drummed against the windows of the old brownstone like nervous fingers tapping out a death march. The air hung thick with the scent of wet leaves and something else, something that made my skin crawl even before I opened the front door. My name is Archie Goodwin, and I've seen my share of desperate men, working as legman and secretary to Nero Wolfe, the finest detective this side of the Atlantic, tends to attract the kind of trouble that leaves permanent stains on both conscience and carpet. But there was something different about the man who stood shivering on our stoop that morning, clutching a leather satchel against his chest like it contained his very soul. He was small and pale, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from too much coffee and too little sleep. His thin hair was plastered to his skull by the rain, and his wire-rimmed spectacles had fogged over completely. But it was his hands that caught my attention. They trembled not with cold, but with the particular terror of a man who knows he's marked for death. "Mr. Goodwin," his voice cracked like a teenager's, "I need to see Nero Wolfe, please, they're going to kill me." I'd heard that plea 1,000 times before, but something in his tone made me step aside without my usual interrogation. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, or how he clutched that satchel like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the living world. Or maybe it was just the rain, which had a way of making everything seem more urgent and desperate than it really was. "Come in," I said, closing the door behind him. "Let me take your coat." He shook his head violently. "No time. I have to see him now, before they find me." The old brownstone on West 35th Street had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical. Its thick walls had absorbed countless secrets, and its rooms had witnessed the unraveling of more criminal schemes than Scotland Yard's files could contain. But as I led this trembling bookkeeper up the stairs to Wolfe's office, I felt the familiar tingle that warned me we were about to dive into something deeper and darker than usual. Nero Wolfe was in his chair behind the massive desk, all 300 pounds, of him settled like a mountain that had decided to take up residence in Manhattan. His round face showed no expression as he looked up from the morning paper, but I caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that meant he was already calculating angles and possibilities. "Sir," I began, but the bookkeeper pushed past me. "Mr. Wolfe, they're going to kill me." He thrust the satchel onto the desk where it landed with a heavy thud. "I took this from Vincent Scalise's office. It's his personal ledger, the real one. Not the books he shows the taxmen, every payoff, every murder, every dirty deal for the last 5 years. It's all in there." Wolfe set down his paper with the deliberate care of a man who never hurried. Unless the building was on fire. Even then he'd probably finish his sentence first. "Your name?" he asked in his cultured voice, the one that could make a simple question sound like a pronouncement from on high. "Tommy Ricci. I've been keeping books for Scalise for 3 years, clean books mostly, or so I thought. But last week I stumbled onto his real operation." Tommy's words came out in a rush like water through a broken dam. "He's been using my legitimate businesses as fronts, laundering money through a dozen different accounts, and the murders—" He shuddered. "Mr. Wolfe, there are at least 15 names in that book. People who crossed him, people who knew too much. And now you know too much," Wolfe observed. Tommy nodded miserably. "He caught me in his office Sunday night. I thought I was dead. But he was drunk, celebrating some big score. Started bragging about how smart he was, how he'd fooled everyone. That's when I realized he'd been using me as his unwitting accountant for a massive criminal enterprise." "So you stole his ledger," I said. "Smart move, Tommy, really smart." The sarcasm was lost on him. "I had to. He was planning to frame me for everything, make me the fall guy when the feds finally closed in. I heard him talking to his lawyer about setting up a paper trail that would lead straight back to me. Wolfe opened the ledger and began turning pages with the same methodical care he used when examining his orchids. The only sound in the room was the whisper of paper and the steady drumming of rain against the windows. After several minutes, he looked up. "This is quite comprehensive. Bank account numbers, wire transfer records, coded references to what I assume are various criminal activities." He turned another page. "Ah yes, here's a section devoted to what appears to be contract killings. Fascinating organizational system. Can you help me?" Tommy leaned forward desperately. "I can pay—" "My fee is quite reasonable," Wolfe interrupted. $25,000 plus expenses." Tommy's face went white. "I don't have that kind of money. I'm just a bookkeeper." "A bookkeeper who has stumbled onto evidence of one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the city," Wolfe corrected. $25,000 is quite reasonable for staying alive." I watched Tommy's face cycle through despair, hope, and something that might have been cunning. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "I have 10,000. Cash. It's everything I could get my hands on." He placed the envelope on the desk next to the ledger. "Please, Mr. Wolfe, I'll find a way to pay the rest." Wolfe considered this, his fingers steepled in front of his massive chest. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the windows into rivers of distorted light. The whole scene felt like something out of a film noir. Desperate man, shadowy, detective, and a fortune in blood money sitting on a desk between them. "Very well," Wolfe said finally. "I'll take your case, Mr. Ricci, but I want you to understand something clearly. Vincent Scalise is not some common street thug. He's a businessman who happens to conduct his business with bullets and bribes. Crossing him requires a very particular kind of courage, the kind that acknowledges death as a distinct possibility." Tommy swallowed hard. "I understand." "I doubt that," Wolfe said mildly. "But we'll proceed nonetheless. Archie, escort Mr. Ricci to the front room. I need to study this ledger more carefully." As I led Tommy out of the office, I caught Wolfe's eye. There was something there I'd seen before, the look of a hunter who's just caught scent of particularly dangerous prey. It both thrilled and worried me. Wolfe's cases had a way of spiraling into complexity, and something told me this ledger was going to drag us into the deepest, darkest corners of the city's criminal underworld. The front room was smaller and more comfortable than Wolfe's office, with leather chairs arranged around a small fireplace that I'd lit earlier to chase away the October chill. Tommy perched on the edge of his seat like a bird ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. "Tell me about Vincent Scalise," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "What kind of man are we dealing with?" Tommy ran his hands through his damp hair. "He's smart, scary smart. Most people think he's just another mob boss, but he's not. He went to college, Columbia, I think, studied business and law. He runs his operation like a corporation, complete with organizational charts and quarterly profit reviews. How'd you end up working for him?" "I answered an ad in the paper. Respectable accounting firm looking for experienced bookkeeper. The salary was good, maybe too good, but I needed the work." Tommy's laugh was bitter. "I should have known something. Was wrong when they paid me in cash and didn't ask for references." "But you didn't suspect anything at first?" "Not really. The books I saw were clean. Scalise owns legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction companies, a few nightclubs. On paper, everything looked normal. It wasn't until I started noticing discrepancies that I began digging deeper." "What kind of discrepancies?" Tommy pulled out a small notebook and flipped through the pages. Invoices for services never rendered. Payments to companies that didn't exist. Large cash deposits with no corresponding income sources. He looked up at me. And then there were the coded entries, things like consultation fee for $50,000 or equipment rental for amounts that didn't make sense. When did you realize what it all meant? About a month ago. I was working late trying to reconcile some accounts that didn't add up when I stumbled across Scalise's private office. He'd left his safe open, something he never did. Inside was the ledger I brought here today, along with some other documents. Tommy's hands started shaking again. Mr. Goodwin, the things in that book. There are records of bribes to city officials, judges, police captains. And the murder. He keeps track of them like business expenses. Date, target, method, cost, it's all there in black and white. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What made you take the book? I heard him on the phone with his lawyer setting me up to take the fall for everything. They were going to make it look like I was the mastermind, that I'd been skimming money and covering it up with false entries. When the feds finally moved in, I'd be the one going to prison while Scalise walked away clean. So you decided to beat him to the punch? Tommy nodded. I waited until he left for a meeting, then went back to his office. I photographed every page of the ledger and took the original. I figured if I had evidence of his real crimes, I could negotiate some kind of deal. Have you contacted the police? Are you kidding? Tommy's laugh was hollow. Half the cops in this precinct are on Scalise's payroll. The other half are too scared to move against him. I needed someone with a reputation, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. I understood his reasoning, but I also knew he'd painted us all into a very dangerous corner. Men like Vincent Scalise didn't negotiate, they eliminated threats. And right now, Tommy Ricci was the biggest threat to Scalise's empire since the EC. Federal government started taking organized crime seriously. Mr. Ricci, I said carefully, you do realize that by bringing that ledger here, you've made us targets too. Tommy's face crumpled. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Everyone says Nero Wolfe is the best detective in the city. If anyone can figure out how to stop Scalise, it's him. Wolfe's good, I agreed, but he's not bulletproof, and Vincent Scalise strikes me as the kind of man who prefers permanent solutions to temporary problems. Before Tommy could respond, we heard the sound of Wolfe's voice calling from his office. When we returned, he was closing the ledger with a satisfied expression. Quite enlightening, he said. Mr. Ricci, this document represents a comprehensive record of criminal activity, spanning several years. If authentic, it would provide prosecutors with enough evidence to dismantle Scalise's entire organization. If authentic, Tommy sputtered. Of course it's authentic. I took it from his personal safe. I'm not questioning your honesty, Wolfe said smoothly. But in matters of this magnitude, verification is essential. Scalise is far too intelligent to keep such damaging evidence unless it serves a purpose. Which raises the question, why did he really leave his safe open that night? I felt my stomach drop. You think it was a setup? I think Mr. Ricci may have been intended to find this ledger, Wolfe said. The question is why. Tommy went pale. That's impossible. He was drunk, celebrating. He would never, Vincent Scalise, built a criminal empire by never leaving anything to chance, Wolfe interrupted. A man of his intelligence doesn't simply forget to secure his most sensitive documents, unless, of course, he wants them to be found. The room fell silent except for the rain, which seemed to be mocking us with its steady rhythm. I could see the wheels turning in Wolfe's massive head, and I didn't like the direction his thoughts were taking. What are you saying? Tommy whispered. I'm saying, Mr. Ricci, that you may have been manipulated from the beginning. The question we need to answer is whether you're an unwitting pawn in a larger game, or if you're playing a more active role than you've led us to believe. Tommy shot to his feet. Are you calling me a liar? I'm calling you a man in an impossible situation who may not be telling us the complete truth, Wolfe said calmly. Sit down, Mr. Ricci. We have work to do. As Tommy reluctantly resumed his seat, I caught Wolfe's eye again. This time I saw something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just intrigued by the case, he was suspicious of our client. And if Nero Wolfe suspected someone of deception, it usually meant we were about to wade into waters deep enough to drown us all. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean while we sat in that warm room, surrounded by secrets and lies. I had the distinct feeling that before this case was over, we'd discover that nothing was quite what it seemed, including the frightened little bookkeeper who'd brought death to our doorstep in the form of a leather-bound ledger outside comma somewhere. In the maze of Manhattan streets, Vincent Scalise was probably wondering when his carefully laid plans would begin to unfold. I had the sinking suspicion that he wouldn't have to wait much longer. The morning dissolved into afternoon as Wolfe continued his examination of the ledger, occasionally making notes in his precise handwriting. Tommy sat in the corner like a man awaiting execution, starting at every sound from the street below. I divided my time between watching both of them and trying to figure out what angle Wolfe was working. Around 2 o'clock, the phone rang. I answered it in my usual professional manner, but the voice on the other end made my blood freeze. Is that you, Archie? The voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of Brooklyn underneath the polish. This is Vincent Scalise. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe, who was watching me with interest. Tommy had gone white as a sheet. I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Scalise, I said into the phone. Oh, I think you do. A certain ledger that went missing from my office, along with a certain bookkeeper who seems to have developed sticky fingers. Still not following you. Scalise's laugh was like ice cubes clinking in an expensive glass. Archie, don't insult my intelligence. I know Tommy Ricci is sitting in your office right now, probably shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, and I know he brought you my property. Let's assume for a moment that you're right, I said carefully. What do you want? I want my ledger back, and I want to have a conversation with Mr. Ricci about the importance of loyalty in business relationships. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Scalise. Does it? How unfortunate. I was hoping it would sound like a reasonable business proposition. I looked at Wolfe, who nodded slightly. What kind of proposition? The ledger is returned to me, undamaged and uncopied. Mr. Ricci and I have our conversation, and then everyone goes back to their normal lives. No police, no prosecutors, no unfortunate accidents in dark alleys. And if we decline your generous offer? The pause stretched long enough for me to count my heartbeats. Archie, I've always respected Nero Wolfe. He's a man of intelligence and discretion, but sometimes even intelligent men make poor choices. I'd hate for this to be one of those times. I'll pass along your message, I said. You do that. And Archie? Don't take too long to decide. Patience isn't one of my stronger virtues. The line went dead. I hung up the phone and turned to find 2 pairs of eyes staring at me with very different expressions. Tommy looked terrified. Wolfe looked intrigued. Vincent Scalise, I announced unnecessarily. What did he want? Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, his ledger back, and a private conversation with you. Tommy bolted for the door, but I was faster. I caught him by the arm and steered him back to his chair. Sit down, Tommy. Running won't solve anything. You don't understand, Tommy struggled against my grip. He'll kill me. That's what the conversation means. Perhaps, Wolfe said mildly, or perhaps not. Archie, what was your impression of Mr. Scalise's tone? I thought about it. Confident, almost amused, like he was playing a game where he already knew the ending. Interesting. And did he make any specific threats? Nothing you could take to court. He's too smart for that. Wolfe nodded slowly. Mr. Ricci, how long have you known Mr. Scalise was aware of your investigation into his affairs? Tommy's face went through several interesting color changes. But I said, what do you mean? I mean, when did you first suspect that Vincent Scalise knew you had discovered his real business? I don't know what you're talking about. Wolfe sighed, the sound of a patient teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. Mr. Ricci, let me explain something to you. Vincent Scalise has survived in a very dangerous business for over 15 years. Men in his position don't survive by being careless with sensitive information. Yet he apparently left his safe open, with his most damaging secrets readily accessible to a curious bookkeeper. This suggests one of two possibilities. Tommy waited, his face a mask of growing dread. Either Mr. Scalise is far less intelligent than his reputation suggests, which seems unlikely given his success, or he wanted you to find that ledger. That's crazy, Tommy whispered. Why would he want me to have evidence against him? An excellent question, Archie. What do you think? I'd been wondering the same thing. Maybe he's planning to discredit the ledger somehow, make it look like fake. Possible. Or perhaps the ledger serves a different purpose entirely. Such as? Wolfe opened the ledger again and turned to a page near the back. Mr. Ricci, are you familiar with the concept of a dead man's switch? Tommy shook his head. It's a safety device that activates when the operator is no longer able to control it. In criminal enterprises, it sometimes takes the form of insurance, evidence. That will be released if something happens to the person who possesses it. You think the ledger is Scalise's insurance policy? I think the ledger is designed to look like evidence against Vincent Scalise, when it's actually something quite different. Wolfe turned another page. Tell me, Mr. Ricci, how many of the names in this book do you recognize? Tommy leaned forward reluctantly. Some of them, other bookkeepers, a few business associates. And these entries here? Wolfe pointed to a section filled with coded notations. Tommy studied the page. I'm not sure. The codes don't match the system I was familiar with. Because they're not Scalise's codes, Wolfe said quietly. They're someone else's entirely. I felt the pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a very expensive lock. You think Scalise is setting someone up. I think Vincent Scalise is a remarkably clever man who has found a way to eliminate a threat while appearing to be the victim himself. Tommy was staring at the ledger like it had suddenly grown fangs. What are you saying? I'm saying, Mr. Ricci, that you may have been recruited to steal evidence that will ultimately destroy someone other than Vincent Scalise. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different, charged with the electricity of approaching revelation. Outside the rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark and threatening. Who? Tommy asked finally. That, Mr. Ricci, is what we're going to find out. But first, I need to know something. When exactly did Vincent Scalise recruit you for this mission? He didn't recruit me. I told you I stumbled onto Mr. Ricci. Wolfe's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Men like Vincent Scalise don't leave $20 million criminal enterprises vulnerable to curious bookkeepers. You were meant to find that ledger. The question is whether you knew it at the time. Tommy's composure finally cracked completely. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob, great racking sobs that shook his entire frame. I didn't have a choice, he whispered through his tears. He had photographs of my sister and her kids. He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd hurt them. And there it was, the truth, ugly and brutal and completely predictable. I should have seen it coming from the moment Tommy walked through our door. What did he ask you to do? Wolfe inquired gently. Take the ledger, bring it to you. Make sure you believed I was just a frightened bookkeeper in over his head. Tommy looked, up his face streaked with tears. He said you'd figure out what the ledger really was, and when you did, you'd know what to do with it. And what is the ledger really, Mr. Ricci? Evidence against Marcus Rothstein. I'd heard the name before. Marcus Rothstein was Vincent Scalise's biggest rival, a man who controlled gambling and loan-sharking operations throughout the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. If Scalise could eliminate Rothstein using doctored evidence, he'd effectively double the size of his territory overnight. How do you know Rothstein? Wolfe asked. I used to work for him before Scalise recruited me. That's why Scalise needed me specifically. I knew Rothstein's organization well enough to make the fake entries look authentic. So you helped create this fabricated ledger? Tommy nodded miserably. Scalise threatened my family. What was I supposed to do? How you were supposed to come to me at the beginning, Wolfe said sternly, before you helped frame an innocent man for crimes he didn't commit. Rothstein isn't innocent, Tommy protested. He's a criminal just like Scalise. That may be true, but he's apparently not guilty of the specific crimes documented in this ledger, which means if this evidence were turned over to law enforcement, Mr. Rothstein would be convicted of crimes committed by his rival. I whistled softly. That's pretty slick. Scalise eliminates his competition and makes himself look like a victim. At the same time, indeed, and he uses a respected detective to legitimize the evidence by discovering its true nature. Except you figured out it was fake. The ledger isn't fake, Wolfe corrected. It's genuine evidence of criminal activity. It simply attributes those activities to the wrong person. Tommy looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, Mr. Ricci, that every crime documented in this ledger actually occurred. The dates, amounts, and methods are all accurate. Vincent Scalise simply substituted Marcus Rothstein's name and organizational codes for his own. How can you be sure? Wolfe opened the ledger to a page filled with financial notations. Because I recognize some of these transactions from newspaper accounts of unsolved crimes. This entry here, for instance, corresponds to the robbery of an armored car in Queens last spring. The amount matches exactly. So the crimes are real, but they're Scalise's crimes, not Rothstein's. It's quite ingenious, really. If law enforcement had received this ledger without our investigation, they would have had Marcus Rothstein arrested within days. Meanwhile, Vincent Scalise would have appeared to be the victim of a theft, making him unlikely to attract further scrutiny. Was beginning to appreciate the elegant complexity of Scalise's plan. What happens now? Now, Wolfe said, closing the ledger with finality, we decide whether to let Vincent Scalise destroy his rival using false evidence or whether we're going to spoil his carefully laid plans. What about Tommy? I asked. And his family? Wolfe considered this. Mr. Ricci, do you have somewhere safe your sister and her children could stay for a few days? Tommy nodded. My aunt has a place upstate, but Scalise will find them eventually. Not if Vincent Scalise has more pressing concerns. To occupy his attention. I didn't like the sound of that. When Wolfe got that particular tone in his voice, it usually meant he was about to do something that would either be brilliant or get us all killed. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking that Vincent Scalise has made a fundamental error in judgment. He's assumed that his reputation for intelligence and ruthlessness would be sufficient to ensure our cooperation. But he's also underestimated the extent to which I dislike being manipulated. So we're going to stop him? We're going to destroy him, Wolfe said calmly. But first we need to ensure Mr. Ricci's family is safe. Archie, make the necessary arrangements. As I reached for the phone, Tommy grabbed my arm. You can't call the police. Scalise has people everywhere. I'm not calling the police, I assured him. I'm calling in a few favors. One of the advantages of working for Nero Wolfe was the extensive network of contacts we'd built up over the years. Within an hour, I'd arranged for Tommy's sister and her children to be quietly relocated to a safe house run by people who specialized in keeping inconvenient witnesses alive, While I was making arrangements, Wolfe had been busy with his own preparations. When I returned to his office, I found him studying a city map covered with red pins. Scalise's operations, I asked. His legitimate businesses, the ones he uses for money laundering. Wolfe tapped one of the pins. This restaurant in Little, Italy has been losing money steadily for 3 years, yet somehow manages to report substantial profits. Cash business, I observed. Easy to inflate the numbers. Precisely. And this construction company has been awarded several city contracts despite submitting bids that were significantly higher than their competitors. Somebody's getting paid off. Undoubtedly. The question is whether we can prove it. I studied the map. What's the plan? The plan is to give Vincent Scalise a choice. He can abandon his scheme against Marcus Rothstein and face justice for his own crimes, or he can watch his entire operation crumble around him. You think he'll back down? I think Vincent Scalise is a businessman above all else. When the costs exceed the potential profits, he'll cut his losses. And if he doesn't, Wolfe's smile was not particularly reassuring, then we'll discover just how far a desperate man will go to protect his empire. The phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. I answered it to find a familiar voice on the other end. Archie, this is Inspector Kramer. I need to talk to Wolfe now. Inspector Kramer of the NYPD had worked with us on dozens of cases over the years. He was honest, competent, and one of the few cops in the city who couldn't be bought. He was also not the kind of man to call in the middle of an investigation unless something had gone seriously wrong. What's the problem, Inspector? The problem is that Vincent Scalise's lawyer just walked into my office with a warrant for the arrest of one Thomas Ricci on charges of embezzlement and theft. I looked at Tommy, who had gone pale again. What kind of evidence are they claiming to have? Financial records showing systematic theft from Scalise's businesses over the past 6 months. Bank records showing deposits into accounts controlled by Ricci. And testimony from 3 witnesses who claim they saw Ricci removing documents from Scalise's office. It's all fabricated, I said. Maybe, but it's convincing fabrication. Archie, if Ricci is there, you need to get him out. Scalise is moving fast, and I won't be able to hold off the arrest warrant much longer. I hung up the phone and turned to Wolfe. Scalise is accelerating his timeline. He's got arrest warrants being issued for Tommy. On what charges? Embezzlement and theft. Kramer says the evidence looks convincing. Wolfe nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Scalise is adapting to circumstances. He's realized that his original plan has been compromised, so he's falling back on a simpler approach. Frame Mr. Ricci for crimes he didn't commit and eliminate him as a threat. What do? We move to the endgame. Mr. Ricci, I need you to call Vincent Scalise. Tell him you're ready to return his ledger. Tommy stared at him. Are you crazy? He'll kill me. Not immediately. He'll want to verify that the ledger is intact and uncopied first. That gives us a window of opportunity. To do what? To ensure that when Vincent Scalise meets with you tonight, he receives a very different surprise than the one he's expecting. He was getting that familiar feeling, the one that told me Wolfe was about to pull one of his elaborate rabbits out of an even more elaborate hat. The feeling was equal parts excitement and terror. What's the plan? I asked. The plan, Archie, is to give Mr. Scalise exactly what he wants. A meeting with Mr. Ricci to discuss the return of his property. What he won't be expecting is the presence of several additional parties who have a very keen interest in the contents of that ledger. Such as Marcus Rothstein, who I believe would be quite interested to learn that someone has been planning to frame him for his rival's crimes. Tommy's eyes widened. You're going to tell Rothstein? Are you insane? He's as dangerous as Scalise. More dangerous, actually, Wolfe agreed, which is precisely why Vincent Scalise has been so careful to avoid direct confrontation with him. Until now, I was beginning to see the outline of Wolfe's strategy, and it was typically audacious. Instead of trying to protect Tommy from Vincent Scalise, he was going to pit the two crime bosses against each other and let them destroy themselves. "There's just one problem," I pointed out. "How do we arrange this meeting without getting ourselves killed in the crossfire?" "Leave that to me," Wolfe said. "You just concentrate on keeping Mr. Ricci alive long enough to make his phone call." As if on cue, we heard the sound of car doors slamming in the street below. I moved to the window and looked down to see 3 men in dark suits standing beside a black sedan. They weren't trying to hide their presence. In fact, they seemed to want us to know they were there. "Scalise's men," Tommy whispered. "Looks like it." I let the curtain fall back into place. "They're not making any move to come up, though, just watching." "They're waiting," Wolfe said. "Mr. Scalise wants us to know that he can reach us whenever he chooses, but he's still hoping to resolve this matter through negotiation rather than violence." "What happens when he gets tired of waiting?" "Then those men will stop being observers and start being participants, which is why we need to move quickly." Wolfe reached for his phone and began dialing. "Mr. Rothstein, this is Nero Wolfe. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance who has been taking liberties with both our reputations." As I listened to Wolfe's half of the conversation, I marveled once again at his ability to turn a desperate situation to his advantage. Within 5 minutes, he'd convinced Marcus Rothstein that Vincent Scalise was not only planning to frame him for murder, but was also using the famous detective Nero Wolfe to legitimize the evidence. Tonight, 10 o'clock. The old warehouse on Pier 47. Wolfe's voice was calm and businesslike. "Bring whatever men you think you'll need, but remember, we want Scalise alive and talking. Dead men can't confess to their crimes." He hung up the phone and turned to Tommy. "Now it's your turn. Mr. Ricci, call Vincent Scalise and tell him you're ready to make a deal." Tommy's hands shook as he dialed the number. When Scalise answered, his voice was smooth and confident. "Tommy, I was hoping to hear from you. Have you had time to reconsider my offer?" "Yes, Mr. Scalise. I want to return your ledger." "Excellent. And what about our mutual friend, Mr. Wolfe? Has he been cooperative?" Tommy looked at Wolfe, who nodded encouragingly. He examined the ledger. "He knows what it really is." "I'm sure he does. Mr. Wolfe is a very intelligent man. Did he happen to mention what he plans to do with this knowledge?" "He said he needed to think about it, but he told me I should return your property and try to work something out." There was a pause. "I see. Well, Tommy, I think we can come to an understanding. Meet me tonight at 10 o'clock. Pier 47, the old Patterson warehouse. Bring the ledger and we'll discuss your future. Employment opportunities." "Just me? Just you and the ledger? Oh, and Tommy, don't disappoint me again. My patience isn't infinite." The line went dead. Tommy set down the phone with trembling hands. "It's done," he whispered. "Indeed it is," Wolfe said with satisfaction. "Archie, we have several hours to prepare. I suggest you make sure your gun is clean and loaded. Are we expecting trouble?" "We're expecting Vincent Scalise and Marcus Rothstein to meet face-to-face for the first time in 5 years, with Mr. Ricci's fabricated ledger as the catalyst." "Yes, Archie, I think we can safely expect trouble." The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Tommy alternated between pacing the floor and staring out the window at Scalise's watches. I spent the time checking our weapons and going over the plan with Wolfe. Though plan might have been too generous a term for what we were attempting. Around 6 o'clock, Inspector Kramer arrived with 2 of his most trusted detectives. He looked like a man who'd been asked to defuse a bomb while blindfolded. "Wolfe, this is insane," he said without preamble. "You're talking about orchestrating a meeting between 2 of the most dangerous criminals in the city." "I'm talking about resolving a situation that threatens to spiral out of control," Wolfe replied calmly. "Would you prefer to let Vincent Scalise frame Marcus Rothstein for crimes he didn't commit?" I'd prefer to arrest them both and let the courts sort it out. On what charges? The evidence against Rothstein is fabricated, and we have no admissible evidence against Scalise. Kramer slumped into a chair. So what's your plan? Get them both in the same room and hope they confess? Something like that. Mr. Ricci will be wearing a wire. Everything that's said will be recorded, and you'll be close enough to intervene if things get out of hand. If things get out of hand, we'll be cleaning up bodies, not making arrests. That's possible, Wolfe acknowledged. But consider the alternative. If we do nothing, Vincent Scalise succeeds in framing his rival, eliminating his competition, and expanding his criminal empire. Meanwhile, an innocent man goes to prison for crimes he didn't commit. Rothstein isn't innocent. He's innocent of the crimes documented in that ledger. In this particular case, that's what matters. I could see Kramer wrestling with the ethics of the situation. He was a good cop, but he was also a practical man. He knew that sometimes you had to choose between imperfect options. All right, he said finally. But I want assurances. No vigilante justice, no summary executions. Whatever happens tonight, it has to be legal. Agreed, Wolfe said. We're seeking confessions, not corpses. As evening approached, we made our final preparations. Tommy was fitted with a wire, a tiny microphone and transmitter that would broadcast everything said within. A 50-foot radius. Kramer and his men would be positioned around the warehouse, ready to move in when we gave the signal. What if Scalise searches me for a wire? Tommy asked nervously. He probably will, I admitted. But this particular device is designed to look like a hearing aid. Unless he's specifically looking for surveillance equipment, he shouldn't spot it. What if Rothstein's men start shooting? Then you hit the floor and stay there until the professionals sort things out. Tommy looked like he was about to be sick. I can't do this, I'm not brave enough. You don't need to be brave, Wolfe said gently. You just need to be convincing. Remember, both Scalise and Rothstein believe they're the smartest man in the room. That arrogance will work to our advantage. How? Because arrogant men make mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities. At 9:30, we piled into Kramer's unmarked police car and headed for the waterfront. The old Patterson warehouse sat at the end of Pier 47 like a monument to industrial decay. Its broken windows stared out at the harbor like empty eyes, and its walls were covered with decades of rust and graffiti. Cheerful place, I observed. Isolated, Kramer corrected. Perfect for the kind of conversation where witnesses aren't welcome. We parked half a block away and checked our equipment one final time. The wire was working perfectly, and Kramer's backup teams were in position around the warehouse. Remember, Wolfe told Tommy, you're a frightened bookkeeper who wants to make a deal. Don't try to be clever, let them do the talking. Tommy nodded, clutching the leather satchel containing the fabricated ledger. What if they realize it's a setup? Then improvise, and whatever happens, don't panic. Panic makes people do stupid things. At exactly 10 o'clock, Tommy walked across the empty lot toward the warehouse entrance. The rest of us settled in to wait and listen to whatever was about to unfold. The first voice we heard through Tommy's wire was Vincent Scalise, smooth and confident as always. Tommy, my boy, right on time. I appreciate punctuality in a business. Partner, I brought the ledger. Tommy's voice was shaky but audible. Excellent. Let me have a look. There was a rustling sound as Scalise examined the fabricated evidence. In the silence, I could hear Tommy's rapid breathing and the distant sound of water lapping against the pier. This seems to be in order, Scalise said finally. Tell me, did Mr. Wolfe examine it carefully? Yes, he spent hours going through it. And what was his conclusion? He said it was evidence of major criminal activity, enough to put someone away, for life. Scalise's laugh was like silk over steel. Indeed it is, though perhaps not the someone Mr. Wolfe was expecting. I don't understand. Of course you don't. That's what makes you so useful, Tommy. Your innocence is quite genuine. Suddenly another voice cut through the night, deeper, more gravelly, with traces of an Eastern European accent. Hello, Vincent. Marcus Rothstein had arrived. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. When Scalise finally spoke, his voice had lost its smooth confidence. Marcus. This is unexpected. Is it? I thought you might be expecting me. After all, you've gone to considerable trouble to get my attention. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Let me refresh your memory. You created a fake ledger containing evidence of crimes you committed but attributed to me. You recruited Tommy here to steal it and bring it to Nero Wolfe, hoping the famous detective would authenticate your fabrication and provide it to law enforcement. I heard Tommy gasp. Apparently, he was just now realizing how completely he'd been manipulated. That's a very interesting theory, Scalise said carefully. It's not a theory, it's a fact. I had my people examine the real records of several crimes documented in that ledger. Crimes you committed, Vincent, not me. Prove it. I don't have to. You're going to prove it yourself. I don't think so. Oh, but you are. Because the alternative is a war between our organizations that will leave half the city in ruins, and we both know you're not ready for that kind of conflict. The conversation was spiraling toward violence faster than I'd expected. I looked at Kramer, who was already reaching for his radio to signal his backup teams. Gentlemen, Tommy's voice, cut through the tension. Maybe we could work something out. Both crime bosses turned their attention back to him. In the silence, I could practically feel their predatory focus shifting to our terrified bookkeeper. What kind of something? Scalise asked. Well, you both seem to want this ledger. Maybe there's a way you could both get what you want. Go on, Rothstein said. Mr. Scalise wants to eliminate his competition. Mr. Rothstein wants to protect himself from false accusations. What if there was a way to accomplish both goals? I had to admire Tommy's nerve. He was improvising brilliantly, buying time and keeping both criminals talking. What are you suggesting? Scalise demanded. I'm suggesting that maybe the ledger doesn't have to point to either one of you. Maybe it could point to someone else entirely. Such as? Such as whoever really committed these crimes. The silence stretched long enough for me to wonder if Tommy had finally pushed too hard. Then Rothstein's gravelly laugh echoed through the warehouse. You know, Vincent, I think I'm beginning to like your bookkeeper. He's more clever than he looks. Clever enough to get himself killed, Scalise said coldly. Now, let's not be hasty. Tommy's raised an interesting point. If neither of us committed these particular crimes, who did? I could hear the trap closing, even if the criminals couldn't. Wolfe had anticipated this exact moment, the point where both men would be forced to admit that the crimes in the ledger were real, even if the attribution was false. The crimes are real, Scalise said finally. But they're not mine. And they're certainly not mine, Rothstein agreed, which raises the question, who's been committing crimes in our territory without permission? Someone with access to both our organizations, Scalise mused. Someone who could make it look like either of us was responsible. Someone like a bookkeeper who worked for both of us at different times, Rothstein added quietly. Tommy, quote, S-sharp intake of breath was clearly audible through the wire. He'd just realized that both criminals were now considering him as the real culprit. That's impossible, he stammered. I'm just a bookkeeper. Just a bookkeeper who somehow managed to steal sensitive documents from a secure office, Scalise observed. Just a bookkeeper who knew enough about both our operations to fabricate convincing evidence, Rothstein added. Just a bookkeeper who brought that evidence to the most famous detective in the city, knowing he'd examine it carefully and discover the truth. Scalise concluded. I could see where this was heading, and it wasn't good. Both criminals were now convinced that Tommy had been playing a deeper game than anyone realized. "Gentlemen," Tommy said desperately, "you're making a mistake. I'm not smart enough to plan something like this." "No," Scalise agreed, "but Nero Wolfe is—" The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Explain," Rothstein commanded. "Think about it, Marcus. The famous detective discovers that someone's been framing you for crimes you didn't commit. He can't let that stand. It would damage his reputation for finding the truth. But he also can't simply turn the evidence over to the police without being sure of its authenticity. So, he arranges for us to meet," Rothstein continued the thought, "forces us to confront each other over the fabricated evidence, and records everything we say," Scalise finished, "creating new evidence that proves both our guilt in a dozen other crimes." Through the wire, I could hear footsteps as both criminals began moving around the warehouse, probably positioning their men for what they now saw as an inevitable confrontation. "Tommy," Rothstein's voice was deadly quiet, "where exactly is Nero Wolfe right now?" I don't know. He just told me to bring you the ledger and work out a deal." "He's here," Scalise said with certainty. "Somewhere close enough to listen, but far enough away to escape if things go badly." "Along with the police," Rothstein added. "This whole meeting is a setup." I looked at Kramer, who was already signaling his teams to close in. Our carefully orchestrated confrontation was about to become a three-way firefight. "Move!" Kramer shouted into his radio. "All units, move now!" The next few minutes were chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Scalise's men, Rothstein's men and Kramer's detectives all opened fire simultaneously. Through the wire, we could hear Tommy screaming, along with the shouts of criminals and police officers trying to identify targets in the darkness. "Tommy!" I shouted into the radio. "Get down and stay down!" But Tommy wasn't listening. Through the static and gunfire, we heard his voice, high and panicked. "Stop! Everybody stop! I have something to say!" Miraculously, the shooting died down. Maybe it was the desperation in Tommy's voice, or maybe everyone was just running low on ammunition. I lied. Tommy's voice came through clearly. "About everything. I'm not just a bookkeeper." "We know," Scalise said grimly. "No, you don't. You think I'm working for Nero Wolfe, but I'm not. I'm working for the FBI." The silence that followed was absolute. "For the past 6 months, I've been gathering evidence on both your organizations. The ledger isn't fake. It's a compilation of real evidence from real crimes. But they're not Vincent's crimes, and they're not Marcus's crimes. They're crimes committed by your lieutenants and underbosses, acting without authorization." "That's impossible," Rothstein said. "Is it? When was the last time you personally verified every operation in your territory? When was the last time you checked to make sure your people weren't freelancing?" I could hear the doubt creeping into both criminals' voices. Tommy had found exactly the right pressure point. The paranoia that came with running a large criminal organization. "The armored car robbery," Tommy continued. "That was Joey Torino's crew, acting on their own. The warehouse fire in Queens? That was your nephew's idea, Mr. Rothstein. He wanted to collect insurance money without clearing it with you first." "You're lying," Scalise said, but he didn't sound convinced. "The murder of Mickey Torino last spring? Your brother-in-law arranged it, Mr. Scalise. He thought Mickey was skimming money from the numbers racket. He was wrong, but he ordered the hit anyway." "That's enough," Rothstein said quietly. "No, it's not, because the real crime isn't what your people have been doing without permission. It's what you've been doing with full knowledge and consent. The FBI has been building cases against both of you for 3 years. This ledger is just the final piece." "Then why the elaborate charade?" Scalise demanded. "Because we needed confessions. Admissions of guilt that would be admissible in court. We needed you both to acknowledge that the crimes in the ledger were real, even if you disputed who committed them. I heard the distinctive click of a gun being cocked, which you've now done, Tommy concluded. Everything you've said tonight has been recorded and transmitted to federal agents positioned around this warehouse. You're both under arrest. The gunfire that erupted was immediate and intense, but this time it was augmented by the voices of FBI agents shouting identification and orders to surrender. Through the chaos, I could hear Tommy's voice one last time. Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin, if you can hear this, I'm sorry I lied to you. But some games are too big for private detectives. Then static filled the radio, and we lost contact. Kramer, and I raced toward the warehouse, but FBI agents in tactical gear stopped us at the perimeter. The special agent in charge was a tall, serious-looking woman who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Martinez. Mr. Wolfe, I'm afraid your services are no longer needed. This is now a federal operation. What about Tommy Ricci? I demanded. Agent Ricci is fine. He's been undercover for the past 8 months, gathering evidence on both the Scalise and Rothstein organizations. Tonight's operation successfully concluded our investigation. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Agent Ricci. FBI, assigned to the Organized Crime Task Force. Everything he told you was part of his cover story. The frightened bookkeeper, the stolen ledger, even the threats to his family, all designed to create a believable scenario that would draw you into the investigation. Why? Wolfe asked quietly. Because Vincent Scalise and Marcus Rothstein are both too smart to confess to federal agents, but they might confess to each other, especially if they thought they were being manipulated by a private detective rather than law enforcement. I looked around at the controlled chaos of the crime scene. FBI agents were everywhere, processing evidence and taking suspects into custody. In the distance, I could see 2 figures in handcuffs being led toward unmarked. Fans, presumably Vincent Scalise and Marcus Rothstein. So we were just props in your operation, I said bitterly. You were essential to its success, Agent Martinez corrected. Nero Wolfe's reputation for intelligence and integrity made the scenario believable. Without his involvement, neither criminal would have taken the bait. What happens now? Wolfe asked. Now we clean up the mess. Both organizations will be dismantled, their assets seized, their members prosecuted. It's the biggest organized crime bust in the city's history. As we walked back to Kramer's car, I tried to process what had just happened. We'd been manipulated as completely as any mark in a confidence game. The frightened bookkeeper had been gay federal agent. The stolen ledger had been genuine FBI evidence. And the whole elaborate scheme had been designed to use our reputation to legitimize a sting operation. How do you feel about being used like that? I asked Wolfe. He considered the question as we settled into the car. Professionally, I'm impressed by the sophistication of the operation. Personally, I'm annoyed by the deception. But ultimately, justice was served, even though we were lied to from the beginning? Even though we were lied to from the beginning. Sometimes, Archie, the ends do justify the means. What about Tommy? I mean, Agent Ricci? Think we'll see him again? I doubt it. Men like him move from one identity to another, like actors changing costumes between performances. The Tommy Ricci we knew never really existed. As we drove through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, I found myself thinking about the nature of truth and deception. We'd spent 2 days trying to unravel a mystery that had been constructed specifically for our benefit. Every clue had been planted, every revelation orchestrated, every moment of danger carefully calibrated to produce the desired result. And yet, in the end, 2 dangerous criminals had been taken off the streets. Their organizations had been dismantled, and their victims had received justice. Did it matter that we'd been unknowing participants in an elaborate deception? The rain had started again, washing the city clean as we made our way back to the brownstone. Tomorrow, there would be headlines. about the biggest organized crime bust in years. Nero Wolfe's name would probably be mentioned, adding another small chapter to his legendary reputation. But tonight, as I sat in the familiar warmth of our office, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been players in someone else's game. The frightened bookkeeper who'd stood on our doorstep that morning had been as fictional as any character in a detective novel. The ledger he'd brought us had been real, but its significance had been carefully orchestrated by minds more devious than Vincent Scalise or Marcus Rothstein. Wolfe poured himself a glass of beer and settled into his chair with a satisfied sigh. An interesting case, Archie. Perhaps not what it appeared to be, but interesting nonetheless. Are you bothered by the fact that we were manipulated? I'm bothered by the fact that it was necessary. If law enforcement agencies have to resort to such elaborate deceptions to catch criminals, it suggests that our legal system has some fundamental weaknesses. But you're not angry. At whom? Agent Ricci was doing his job. Agent Martinez was conducting a legitimate investigation. The criminals we helped capture were genuinely guilty of the crimes they were accused of. So everyone wins. Everyone except the truth, Wolfe said quietly. In a world where federal agents masquerade as frightened bookkeepers and private detectives become unwitting props in government operations, truth becomes just another tool to be manipulated. I thought about that as I prepared for bed. The case was closed, justice had been served, and 2 dangerous criminals were in custody. By any objective measure, we'd been on the winning side. So why did I feel like we'd lost something important? Maybe it was the realization that in a world of professional liars and elaborate deceptions, even the most careful detective could be fooled. Or maybe it was the understanding that truth itself had become a commodity, to be bought, sold, and manipulated by whoever had the most resources and the fewest scruples. The next morning brought newspaper headlines trumpeting the FBI's success in breaking up 2 major crime families. Nero Wolfe's role in the investigation was mentioned prominently, adding to his already considerable reputation. Several reporters called asking for interviews, but Wolfe declined them all. Why? I asked. This kind of publicity is usually good. For business. Because I'm not entirely sure what role we actually played, Wolfe replied. Were we detectives solving a case, or were we unwitting actors in a performance designed to fool criminals? The distinction matters. Does it? In the end, the bad guys are in jail. Yes, but at what cost? If law enforcement agencies can manipulate private citizens, even experienced investigators, so completely, what does that say about the nature of justice in our society? I'd been wondering the same thing. The more I thought about our involvement in the case, the more uncomfortable I became with the implications. If the FBI could orchestrate such an elaborate deception using respected private detectives, what other manipulations might be taking place without our knowledge? Maybe we're overthinking this, I suggested. Maybe sometimes you have to use criminals' own tactics against them. Perhaps. But when the distinction between law enforcement and criminal enterprise becomes so blurred that honest citizens can't tell the difference, we've lost something essential to our democracy. The phone rang, interrupting our philosophical discussion. I answered it to find Inspector Kramer on the line. Wolfe around? He asked. Right here. What's the problem? No problem. Just wanted to thank you both for your help with the Scalise case. The FBI is calling it one of the most successful organized crime operations in years. We were happy to help, I said, though I wasn't sure that was entirely true. There's one thing, though. The FBI wants to debrief you both about your interactions with Agent Ricci. They want to make sure there are no loose ends that could compromise future operations. What kind of debriefing? Just a formal interview. Questions about what Ricci told you, how he behaved, whether you suspected anything. Standard procedure. I looked at Wolfe, who shook his head slightly. Tell them we'll think about it, I said. Archie, these aren't the kind of people you keep waiting. They've been very patient about your involvement in their operation, but they expect cooperation. They'll get it. We just need a day or two to process what happened. One day, after that, I can't guarantee they'll remain so understanding." He hung up, leaving us to contemplate the implications of our new relationship with federal law enforcement. Apparently, our involuntary participation in their operation had created certain obligations. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the busy street below. Finally he sighed and turned back to me. "We'll cooperate, of course, but first I want to understand something. Contact Agent Martinez. Tell her I'd like to speak with Agent Ricci, privately." "You think she'll agree to that?" "I think Agent Martinez is a professional who understands the value of maintaining good relationships with useful assets." "Is that what we are now? Assets?" "That, Archie, is precisely what I intend to find out." It took several phone calls and considerable negotiation, but Agent Martinez finally agreed to arrange a meeting with Agent Ricci. The location was neutral territory, a coffee shop in Midtown, far from both FBI headquarters and our own brownstone agent. Ricci looked different without the fear and desperation that had defined Tommy the bookkeeper. He was still small and pale, but his eyes held a confidence that had been completely absent during his performance at our office. "Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin, I owe you both an apology." "You owe us an explanation," Wolfe corrected. "The apology is optional?" Ricci smiled ruefully. "Fair enough. What would you like to know?" "Everything from the beginning." "The beginning was 8 months ago, when the FBI decided that traditional investigation methods weren't working against the Scalise and Rothstein organizations. Both men were too smart, too careful, too well insulated by layers of subordinates and lawyers. So you decided to use us as bait." "Not exactly. We decided to create a situation where they'd incriminate themselves. Your involvement was designed to make that situation believable." "Why us specifically?" "Because you have something the FBI doesn't: credibility with criminals. Both Scalise and Rothstein respect your reputation. They'd believe evidence that came from your investigation in a way they'd never believe evidence from federal agents." Wolfe nodded slowly. "And the ledger?" "Completely genuine. Every crime documented in that book really happened, committed by members of both organizations. We'd been gathering evidence for years, but we needed a way to present it that would force both leaders to acknowledge its authenticity. By making them think they were being framed." "Exactly. We knew that if they believed someone was trying to frame them for each other's crimes, they'd be motivated to prove their innocence by admitting their own guilt. I had to admire the psychological sophistication of the plan." "What about your family? The threats?" "My sister and her kids are fine. They were never in any real danger, though we did relocate them as a precaution." "How long have you been planning this operation?" 2 years. We've been building false identities, planting evidence, cultivating relationships with key figures in both organizations. Your case was just the final act." "What happens now?" Agent Ricci's expression grew serious. "Now we prosecute the cases we've built. Both Scalise and Rothstein are looking at life sentences. Their organizations will be dismantled, their assets seized, their members prosecuted or flipped to provide evidence against other criminal enterprises. And you?" "I disappear. Tommy Ricci was just another identity. Next month I'll be someone else working on a different case in a different city. Doesn't that get lonely?" For the first time, Agent Ricci's professional composure slipped slightly. "It's the job. Some people investigate crimes, others go undercover to prevent them. We all make sacrifices." "Was any of it real?" I asked. "The fear, the desperation, the gratitude." "The fear was real," he admitted. "I've been deep undercover for so long that sometimes I forget which identity is supposed to be the real one. When I walked into your office that morning, I was genuinely terrified that I'd blown my cover. But you hadn't. No, you and Mr. Wolfe played your parts perfectly. Better than we'd hoped, actually. Our parts, Wolfe repeated quietly. Look, I know how that sounds, but what we accomplished was important. Two of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the city have been neutralized. Dozens of unsolved. Crimes have been cleared. Hundreds of potential victims have been saved, at the cost of turning private citizens into unwitting government agents, at the cost of using every resource available to us in the fight against organized crime. Sometimes the ends really do justify the means. That's what I was afraid you'd say, Wolfe murmured. Agent Ricci looked puzzled. What do you mean? I mean that when law enforcement agencies begin to think like criminals, the distinction between justice and revenge becomes meaningless. That's not what happened here. Isn't it? You lied, manipulated, deceived, and endangered innocent people to achieve your goals. How is that different from what Vincent Scalise was doing? Because we're the good guys, Agent Ricci said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. Are you? Or are you just criminals with badges? The question hung in the air between us like smoke, from a gun that had already been fired. Agent Ricci stared at Wolfe for a long moment, then looked away. I need to get back, he said finally. The debriefing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock, Federal Building, room 847. Please don't be late. He left without shaking hands, walking quickly toward the street where a dark sedan was waiting. As we watched him drive away, I found myself wondering which identity he'd be wearing by the time he reached his destination. So what do you think? I asked. I think we've just had a glimpse into the future of law enforcement in America, Wolfe said grimly. A future where the distinction between criminal and cop is determined not by methods, but by objectives. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Ask me again in 10 years when the techniques they perfected on Vincent Scalise are being used on political dissidents and inconvenient journalists. We walked back to the brownstone in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The case that had begun with a frightened bookkeeper on our doorstep had evolved into something much larger and more disturbing, a window into a world where truth was just another weapon in an arsenal of deception. That evening, as I sat in the office going over the day's mail, I found myself thinking about Agent Ricci's question. Were we the good guys? In a world where federal agents masqueraded as criminals and private detectives became unwitting props in elaborate government operations, how could anyone be sure? The phone rang, interrupting my brooding. I answered it to find a familiar voice, smooth, cultured, with just a hint of Brooklyn underneath the polish. Hello, Archie, this is Vincent Scalise. I nearly dropped the phone. That's impossible. You're in federal custody. Am I? Are you sure about that? I looked at Wolfe, who was listening with interest but didn't seem particularly surprised. What do you want, Mr. Scalise? I want to thank you and Mr. Wolfe for your assistance in my recent business transaction. What business transaction? The one where I eliminated my competition and expanded my territory, all while appearing to be the victim of an elaborate government conspiracy. I don't understand. Scalise's laugh was like silk over steel. Of course you don't. That's what made you so useful. Tell me, Archie, did you really think the FBI could infiltrate my organization so easily? Did you really think I'd be fooled by an undercover agent, no matter how convincing his performance? You knew about Agent Ricci. I've known about Agent Ricci since the day he first applied for a job with one of my front companies. I've been feeding him information for 8 months, letting him think he was gathering evidence when he was actually documenting crimes committed by Marcus Rothstein's organization. I felt the world spinning around me. The ledger contains genuine evidence of criminal activity, but the crimes documented were committed by Rothstein's people, not mine. Agent Ricci simply didn't realize that I was using him to build a case against my rival. But you were arrested, was I? Or did I simply disappear into federal custody long enough to allow my lawyers to negotiate a very favorable plea agreement? Marcus Rothstein is dead, Archie. Killed while resisting arrest during last night's raid. His organization has been dismantled, his territory absorbed into mine. The room felt like it was tilting. What about Agent Ricci? What about him? He served his purpose. The FBI got their headlines, I got my rival eliminated, and you got the satisfaction of seeing justice served. Everyone wins. Except the truth. Truth is overrated, Archie. Results are what matter. And the results couldn't be better. What do you want from us now? Nothing. You've already given me everything I needed. I just wanted to call and express my gratitude. Oh, and to make sure you understand that this conversation never happened. Is that a threat? It's a fact. You have no evidence that this call took place, no way to prove any of what I've just told you. Even if you could, who would you report it to? The FBI agents who were manipulated just as completely as you were. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone like it had just bitten me. Well? Wolfe asked calmly. I told him everything, Scalise had said. When I finished, Wolfe nodded as if he'd been expecting something like this. You don't seem surprised, I observed. I've been suspicious since yesterday morning. Vincent Scalise didn't survive 15 years in organized crime by being careless with sensitive information. The idea that he'd simply leave his safe open for a curious bookkeeper to discover was always implausible. So you think he's telling the truth? That he manipulated the FBI into eliminating his rival? I think Vincent Scalise is exactly what he's always been. A very intelligent man who uses everyone around him to achieve his goals. The FBI thought they were using us to trap him, but he was using all of us to trap Marcus Rothstein. What do we do now? Now we go to tomorrow's debriefing and tell the federal agents exactly what they want to hear. That Agent Ricci was convincing, that we never suspected his true identity, and that we're grateful to have played a role in such a successful operation. We don't tell them about Scalise's call. What call? As Mr. Scalise pointed out, we have no evidence that any such conversation took place. I slumped in my chair, feeling like a chess piece that had just realized it was being played by multiple grandmasters simultaneously. So we do nothing. We do our job, Wolfe corrected. We investigated a case, uncovered the truth, and helped ensure that justice was served. The fact that the truth was more complex than anyone realized doesn't change our fundamental responsibility. But Scalise is still out there, still running his criminal empire. Is he? Or is he simply another player in a game whose rules we don't fully understand? Perhaps Vincent Scalise's empire will prove to be more fragile than he believes. Perhaps his manipulation of federal agents will eventually be discovered. Perhaps his elimination of Marcus Rothstein will create new enemies he hasn't anticipated. You sound like you're hoping for poetic justice. I'm hoping for actual justice, Archie. But I've learned over the years that sometimes justice takes forms we don't recognize at the time. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. In the space of 3 days, we'd been recruited by a frightened bookkeeper who turned out to be an FBI agent, manipulated by federal law enforcement into authenticating evidence against organized crime figures, and possibly used by one criminal. To eliminate another dot, the morning brought no new clarity, only the obligation to attend our debriefing with the FBI. Agent Martinez was waiting for us in a sterile conference room in the federal building, along with 2 other agents I didn't recognize. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. This shouldn't take long. Just a few routine questions about your interactions with Agent Ricci. For the next hour, we answered questions about Tommy's behavior, his story, and our investigation of the ledger. Wolfe was his usual precise self, providing detailed answers that were completely truthful while revealing nothing of substance about our suspicions. "Did Agent Ricci's cover story seem credible to you?" Agent Martinez asked. "Completely," Wolfe replied. "He presented as a man, under considerable stress, which was entirely consistent with his claimed circumstances. Did you suspect at any point that he might not be who he claimed to be?" "Not until the final moments of the operation, when he revealed his true identity." "What about the ledger? Did you find anything suspicious about its contents?" "The ledger appeared to be authentic evidence of significant criminal activity. That was the conclusion of my examination. All true as far as it went." Wolfe simply didn't mention his suspicions about who had really committed the crimes documented, or his theory about Vincent Scalise's true role in the operation. "One final question," Agent Martinez said. "Have either of you been contacted by any representatives of the Scalise or Rothstein organization since the arrests?" I felt Wolfe's eyes on me as I answered. "No contact whatsoever." "Good. If anyone does try to reach you, please notify us immediately. These people don't forget perceived slights, and your role in their arrest makes you potential targets." "We understand," Wolfe said. As we left the federal building, I found myself scanning the street for watchers. The paranoia that comes with deep involvement in criminal cases was setting in, the feeling that everyone might be something other than what they appeared. "Think they bought it?" I asked. "I think Agent Martinez is far too intelligent to accept everything at face value," Wolfe replied. "But she's also a professional who understands that some questions are better left unasked." "What happens if Scalise contacts us again?" "He won't. He's achieved his objectives and has no further use for us. From his perspective, we're just another pair of useful idiots who served their purpose." That's a comforting thought. It should be. The most dangerous moment in any criminal investigation is when you become valuable enough to eliminate. If Vincent Scalise considers us irrelevant, we're much safer than we would be if he thought we posed a threat. We spent the rest of the day returning to normal routines, answering correspondence, reviewing potential new cases, tending to the mundane business of running a detective agency. But underneath the familiar activities, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. 3 days later, the newspapers carried a small story buried on page 6 of the Metro section. Vincent Scalise had been found dead in his federal holding cell, apparently the victim of a heart attack. No foul play was suspected, though the story noted that Scalise had been under enormous stress since his arrest. "Convenient," I observed. Showing the article to Wolfe. "Predictable," he corrected. Vincent Scalise knew too much about too many people. His continued existence represented a threat to individuals far more powerful than Marcus Rothstein. "You think he was murdered?" "I think Vincent Scalise was a man who lived by violence and manipulation. Such men rarely die peacefully in their beds. What about Agent Ricci? Think he's safe?" "Agent Ricci has the protection of the federal government and the anonymity of deep cover. He's probably safer than we are." I wasn't entirely convinced, but I didn't pursue the subject. Some questions are better left unanswered, especially when the answers might prove more disturbing than ignorance. The weeks that followed brought a return to more conventional cases: adultery investigations, missing persons, corporate fraud, normal crimes committed by normal people for normal reasons. After the labyrinthine complexities of the Scalise affair, there was something reassuring about cases where the truth was simply the truth, without layers of deception and manipulation. But late at night, when the brownstone was quiet and the city slept fitfully outside our windows, I found myself thinking about Tommy Ricci and Vincent Scalise, about federal agents who lived false lives and criminals who manipulated law enforcement. Agencies like chess masters moving pieces on a board. In the end, justice had been served, Criminals were dead or in prison, their organizations dismantled, their victims avenged. But the methods used to achieve that justice raised questions I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. When the good guys start using the bad guys' tactics, when truth becomes just another weapon in an arsenal of deception, what happens to the principles that are supposed to separate civilization from chaos? I never found a satisfactory answer to that question. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe in a world where criminal enterprises operate like corporations and law enforcement agencies operate like military units, the old distinctions between right and wrong, legal and illegal, moral and immoral become meaningless luxuries. Or maybe that's exactly the kind of thinking that creates the problems in the first place. One evening in December, nearly 2 months after the Scallies affair had ended, I was walking home from dinner when I noticed a small pale man in wire-rimmed spectacles standing under a streetlight across from our brownstone. He looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place him until he turned slightly and I caught his profile. Agent Ricci, or whoever he was calling himself these days. I crossed the street casually, trying not to look like I was approaching him deliberately. "Beautiful evening," I said when I was close enough to speak without shouting. He looked at me without surprise, as if he'd been waiting for me to notice him. "Mr. Goodwin, you're looking well." "Can't complain. What brings you to the neighborhood?" "Nostalgia, maybe. This case was significant for me." "How so?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the windows of Wolfe's office. "It was the first time I wasn't sure which side I was really on." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Vincent Scalise was smarter than any of us realized. He played the FBI, he played you and Mr. Wolfe, he played Marcus Rothstein. In the end, he got exactly what he wanted. Justice was served." Agent Ricci's laugh was bitter. "Was it?" Scalise eliminated his rival, expanded his territory, and died before he could be prosecuted for his crimes. Rothstein is dead, his organization absorbed into Scalise's empire. The FBI got headlines and commendations for a successful operation, but the net result was to strengthen organized crime in the city, not weaken it. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe the line between criminal and cop isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. Maybe we're all just players in games whose rules we don't understand. That's a dangerous way of thinking for a federal agent. It's a realistic way of thinking for someone who's spent 8 months living lies and manipulating people for the greater good." He turned to look at me directly. "Tell me something, Mr. Goodwin. When you look back on this case, do you feel proud of the role you played?" "I feel like we did our job." "But do you feel proud?" I thought about it. "I feel like we served justice as best we understood it at the time." "That's not what I asked." "No, it's not." I met his eyes. "But it's the only answer I can give." "Agent." Ricci nodded slowly. "Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do, serve justice as we understand it, and hope we're not making things worse." "What happens now? For you, I mean." "Now I become someone else in some other city, building another identity to infiltrate another criminal organization. It's what I do." "Doesn't sound like much of a life." "It's the life I chose." He turned to go, then paused. "Give my regards to Mr. Wolfe. Tell him that sometimes the truth really is more complex than it appears. He already knows that." "I'm sure he does. Men like Nero Wolfe usually understand more than they let on." I watched him walk away until he disappeared into the crowd of evening pedestrians. I never saw him again, though occasionally I'd notice small news stories about organized crime investigations in other cities, and wonder if Agent Ricci was involved, wearing yet another identity in service of yet another elaborate deception. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair reading a book about orchid cultivation. He looked up as I entered. Interesting walk. I ran into an old acquaintance, someone who wanted to be remembered to you. Ah. And what message did this acquaintance want to convey? That sometimes the truth is more complex than it appears. Wolfe smiled slightly. A profound observation. Did you agree? I told him you already knew that. Indeed I do. The question is whether such knowledge makes us wiser or simply more cynical. What's your opinion? My opinion is that wisdom and cynicism are often indistinguishable, at least to outside observers. The difference lies in what we choose to do with our knowledge. And what do we choose to do? We choose to continue seeking truth, even when we know it will be complex, disturbing, and probably incomplete. We choose to serve justice, even when we're not entirely sure what justice means. And we choose to believe that these choices matter, even when evidence suggests otherwise. That sounds almost like faith. Perhaps it is. Faith that the accumulated weight of individual moral choices eventually tips the balance toward something better, even if we can't see the results in our lifetime. I settled into my chair, thinking about Agent Ricci walking through the December night toward whatever identity waited for him next. Somewhere in the city, other federal agents were probably building other elaborate deceptions, using other unwitting citizens to achieve other questionable victories in the endless war between law and crime. Do you ever wonder if we're making a difference? I asked. Every day, Wolfe replied. But wondering and knowing are different things. I know that we seek truth when others prefer comfortable lies. I know that we defend the innocent when others find it easier to blame the victims. I know that we insist on justice when others settle for revenge or profit. Is that enough? It has to be. Because the alternative, accepting that none of it matters, that truth and lies are equivalent, that justice and injustice are simply matters of perspective, leads to a world where Vincent Scalise and Marcus Rothstein are the only kinds of men with power. Outside, the city continued its restless existence, millions of people pursuing their own goals through means fair and foul. In corporate boardrooms and back alleys, in federal buildings and criminal enterprises, the eternal struggle between order and chaos, truth and deception, justice and expedience played out in countless variations. And in one brownstone on West 35th Street, two men sat quietly reading, committed to the increasingly unfashionable notion that some things, truth, justice, the protection of the innocent, were worth pursuing even when the pursuit itself became tainted by the very corruption it sought to combat. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was something. And in a world where agents of law lived lives built on lies and criminals manipulated federal investigations like elaborate chess games, something felt like enough. At least for now. The months passed, and the Scalise case became just another file in our cabinet. Another story to be told when clients needed reassurance about our capabilities. But the questions it raised never quite faded. Questions about the nature of truth in a world built on deception. About the meaning of justice when the just and unjust used identical methods. About the responsibility of individuals caught up in games whose rules they didn't understand. I never found complete answers to those questions. Maybe complete answers don't exist. Maybe the best we can do is muddle through, making the best choices we can with incomplete information, and hoping that our intentions matter more than our inevitable failures. But sometimes, late at night when the brownstone creaks and settles around us, I think about a small pale man who may or may not have been named Tommy Ricci, who brought us a ledger full of blood and lies, and I wonder whether we served justice or merely provided another layer of legitimacy to an elaborate criminal conspiracy. I suppose in the end that's for others to judge. All I know is that when a frightened man appeared on our doorstep, claiming that bookkeepers' ledgers carry more blood than ink, we did what we've always done. We sought the truth, defended the innocent, and insisted on justice, even when we weren't. entirely sure what those words meant. Even when the truth proved more complex than we'd imagined. Even when justice wore the faces of federal agents and criminals alike. It wasn't perfect. But it was what we had to offer. And sometimes, in a world where perfection is impossible and compromise inevitable, what we have to offer is enough. Even now, years later, I still find myself wondering about that case. Was justice truly served when Vincent Scalise died in his cell? Or did we merely witness the final move in a game whose real winners remain hidden? Could we have seen through the deception sooner if we'd been less eager to believe in the righteousness of our cause? Tell me, my reader, what would you have done when that frightened bookkeeper appeared on your doorstep? Would you have seen through his performance, or would you too have been drawn into the web of lies and manipulation that surrounded us all? And where in the world are you reading this from, I wonder? In the end, the answers we find are rarely as important as the questions they leave behind. The truth, it seems, is always more complex than it appears, and perhaps that complexity is the only truth we can rely on.